Greetings, comrades, and thank you for joining me for another episode of Ushanka Show. Здравствуйте, дорогие товарищи. My name is Sergey, and back in 1971 I was born in the USSR. Меня зовут Сергей, и в 1971 году я родился в Советском Союзе. And today we're going to talk about censura, censorship in the Soviet Union. Okay, boys and girls, let's get ready for a short lesson of the Russian language. Мальчики и девочки, давайте приготовимся к короткому уроку русского языка. Цензура. Censura, which means censorship, and I assume it's probably came to Russian language from German, because it sounds quite German like censur. Correct me if anyone knows anything about it. I think we all can agree that censorship, censura, always plays huge part in the life of any totalitarian society, and Soviet Union was not an exception from the rule. And censura is kind of like interesting animal. It's like an invisible hand. You don't really see what it's going on. You kind of just see the results of stripped down newspapers, TV programming, and books. I have no doubt that censura was very painful for the content creators, so journalists, writers, movie makers. They suffered a lot because it pretty much was like a knee placed firmly on the neck of creators. But for the consumers, for people like me, it just made mass media, it made books and shows extremely boring because everything was removed that was of some concern. Any stories about crime, about car accidents, airplanes crashes and stuff like that, everything was removed. But one time, back in 1984, I experienced Soviet censura firsthand, and it made me extremely upset, as well as millions of other people. So today is the story about that event of 1984. And it just dawned on me, we're gonna talk about events of 1984, and the book of 1984 was one of the victims of Soviet censorship. That's pretty ironic. So back in 1984, I was 13 years old, and I was the avid reader. I liked to read books, newspapers, magazines, anything I could get my hands on. Remember my uncle Misha, Dядя Misha, the artist? So everything began when my family came to visit his Khrushchevka apartment. So my uncle had two kids, Tanya and Alexander. So my cousins, and Alexander was subscribing to a magazine called Техника молодежи. So this magazine, Техника молодежи, which can be translated like techniques or mechanics for youth, it's kind of similar to Popular Mechanics. So, but it was only towards like young people. That magazine was not easy to subscribe to. I think it was like a limited amount was available, but my cousin was getting that magazine. Back in the 70s and 80s, Техника молодежи was extremely popular. I think they had 1.7 million volumes printed every month. One of the many reasons why I love that magazine is because they published really cool short articles about tanks. They had short article and awesome drawing. Like view from the front, view from the top, really accurate, and that was amazing. So yeah, World of Tanks, Soviet style. And I think those pictures, those articles inspired me to draw and design my own tanks like you see on these pictures. I did tons of that. Another reason why I like that magazine so much, as well as millions of other Soviet teenagers, is that Техника молодежи published really good science fiction stories written by Soviet writers as well as foreign writers. For example, in 1980, Техника молодежи published the novel by Arthur Clarke, The Fountains of Paradise, and apparently that was a huge deal. But of course, back in 1980, I was only 9-year-old and I didn't read any science fiction back then. Техника молодежи was also popular among many people who were interested in electronic games for the programmed calculators. Similar thing probably happened in America. Some very nerdy nerd came up with formulas that you can program into your calculator and create some kind of game. And once we mentioned program calculator, I just want to let you know that in the Soviet Union, the very first programmed microcalculator was manufactured back in 1977. It was called Elektronika BZ21. The most amazing thing about that calculator was its price. In 1977, Elektronika was 350 rubles. So a Soviet engineer who needed that calculator had to work almost 3 months to afford that calculator. When I went to the Soviet high school, which we didn't really have a high school, but in the 9th grade, I got my own program calculator. It was a newer model called MK54, and the price was only 65 rubles, so that was a half of my mother's monthly salary. And I got a little bit into these electronic games for the calculators, but punching these super long formulas were so boring that I wasn't really into it, just a little bit. Sorry about this little detour, and now we're back to my story about visiting my uncle Misha and discovering Техника молодежи. Even several years later, in 1984, and my guess that was probably like a fall of 1984 or winter, when we visited my uncle, I was once again interested in Техника молодежи magazine just to check out the tanks. And I had no clue that in February of 1984, this magazine began publishing the famous 2010 Odyssey 2 by Arthur Clarke. And of course, we're talking about events that happened 36 years ago, so I don't remember exactly everything. But I believe while my parents were hanging out, my relatives were just eating and talking, watching TV, I began reading that story and I got so into it that it was just amazing. It's quite possible that Odyssey 2 was the very first science fiction story that I read that wasn't written by the Soviet writer, so that was a very unusual experience. I'm not sure how many of you guys are familiar with this whole Space Odyssey story. I need to read it again, but part 2 begins with the Soviet-American crew flying the spaceship Alexei Leonov, which is the name of the Soviet cosmonaut. I think he was the very first person that went into open space, so he left the spaceship and it was in open space. It was Alexei Leonov. So I quickly went through the part that was published in February. Then I grabbed March issue. So they published small, 5 pages of book in each issue. Then I went for March issue, gobbled that up, went for April issue. So I flipped through all the pages in the April issue and there was nothing. I checked several times, what is going on, but there was no Space Odyssey Part 3 in the April issue. So I found my uncle, asked him for the rest of the Техника молодежи magazine for that year. And I said I think we were there in the fall, so he gave me the rest, and I checked May, I checked June, July, August, and there was nothing. I thought I'm going completely insane. It says to be continued, but nothing continued. I asked my cousin, Alexander, asked my uncle. Of course, they had no clue. And that was so disappointing. Can you imagine you watching a movie and it's right at the beginning of the movie when you just getting interested, they just shut off the movie and no explanation, nothing, it's just gone. So that's what happened to me with Техника молодежи and Space Odyssey from 2010. So I had to live with this mystery of vanishing story in the magazine for years. They actually, when the glasnost kicked in, they managed to publish that story, to finish it in 1989, so 5 years later. So let's find out what the hell happened back in 1984 with the Space Odyssey 2010. And as you may guessed already, we're going to talk about Soviet censorship, about Советская цензура. I don't know if you're familiar with this book, but Arthur Clarke dedicated his Space Odyssey 2010 to 2 people. One was the famous Soviet cosmonaut Alexei Leonov that we mentioned before, and another guy was Andrei Sakharov, a well-known Soviet nuclear physicist who designed Soviet thermonuclear weapons. So out of these 2 famous Soviet people, Soviet censura had an issue with one, and I wonder if you guys know, or you can try to guess, which one was the problem for the Soviet government. If your answer was Andrei Sakharov, good job. You know your Soviet history. Despite all his achievements, he got in serious trouble with the Soviet government because of his anti-war and human rights activism. So Andrei Sakharov was not a good guy anymore for the Soviet Union. So after Soviet censura, Andrei Sakharov's name was removed. A couple of first chapters were really carefully changed, and the whole book became like twice shorter. So they trimmed quite a bit of anything they didn't like. There were two other moments that the Soviet censura wasn't really happy about. First one was about competition between Chinese space expedition and the Soviet American expedition, which is kind of impressive for Arthur Clarke to predict Chinese rise because this book was written back in 1982. And another part they didn't like it was when the Russian or Soviet female cosmonaut lady, Zhenya, was getting kind of chummy with an American. So that was that situation about sex, and then, as we all know, there was no sex in the Soviet Union. So as I mentioned earlier, the first two chapters of Odyssey 2 were published in February and March of Техника Молодежи magazine. But then on March 28, the International Herald Tribune newspaper published an article about Soviet translation of the book and provided some quite interesting information. The newspaper complimented Arthur Clarke for carefully planting last names of the Soviet dissidents into the book because 7 Russian cosmonauts carried last names of the Soviet dissidents. For example, Zhenya Marchenko, that cute Soviet cosmonaut that got chummy with an American, she had the same last name as Anatoly Marchenko, that was a Soviet dissident who was imprisoned. Imaginal Soviet cosmonaut Orlov had the same last name as Yuri Orlov, another Soviet scientist and a dissident. And the rest of the history. Soviet KGB learned about that article. They made a couple phone calls, and quite a few people, and that magazine, Техника Молодежи, got in serious trouble. The chief editor of the magazine, Vasily Zakharchenko, was fired. Despite the fact he was a famous writer, he was actually the one who made the magazine so popular. Despite his experience, his age, on April 10, 1984, he was fired, sent to be retiree, got canceled his visas for going to other countries, and lost all his privileges. And it was forbidden to continue publishing Odyssey 2, so after only 2 chapters, they just stopped publishing, as I mentioned earlier in this video. And apparently thousands and thousands of letters poured into the magazine with requests what happened. And I guess somehow I missed, but in the May issue of the magazine, they published like really short note without explanation what happened. They just, this is what's going to happen in this book, but we're not going to publish the rest. And they just basically, like a spoiler alert, told you the whole story in literally in 200 words. This is what the rest of the book is about. And only in 1989, 1990, all because of perestroika, we had our happy ending, and Техника Молодежи published the rest of the story using same illustrations by Robert Avotin. So this book got delayed for 5 years, but finally Soviet readers could enjoy this beautiful book, 2010 Odyssey 2. So yeah, this is how I experienced on my own skin the sharp claws of the Soviet censorship. And I said I was so upset back then because they just snatched it up from you, and for many years I had no idea what happened. Okay, my friends, I hope you enjoyed this story, and I'm very curious if you're familiar with this book, Space Odyssey series. I need to read it again. I think I went through whole Odysseys several years ago, but I never watched the movies. I tried to see if it's available, but they want $7.99 to buy Space Odyssey 2010. It's not available for rent, which I found really bizarre. So anyways, please share your thoughts, and we'll talk to you soon. До свидания. Goodbye. Pushkin Diaries is available on Amazon.com, or shoot me an email if you would like to have a signed copy. Thank you! And if you love my channel and would like to show your support, please click on the link below this video and become the patron of the Ushanka Show. For as little as $1, you can help us grow and create the new, interesting videos about the life in Soviet Union.